Minu, right? What is this Angra Minu? Gere, constrained, constricted. This is the force or counter force is constraining progress, is suffocating life. It means Ahura Mazda is not omnipotent. Okay, he's neither omnipotent nor omniscient. And this is really important because many theologians have recognized, and on account of this fact, Zoroastrianism doesn't face the problem of evil. In any religion where you have an omniscient and omnipotent God, there's the problem of God being responsible for all the evil in the world. You cannot have free will and have an omnipotent and omniscient God. Observe, discern, and choose which of the forces you want to align yourself with. The Devas are aligned with Angra Minu. There is this very strange passage in the Gathas, which, if you ask me, aligns with the myth of Atlantis that you find in Plato, that when the Devas were deliberating, Angra Minu came in and he, as a great deceiver, confused their deliberations, and they rushed in wrath and destroyed the life of mankind. Well, what is this talking about? This is talking about when Zeus calls a convocation of the Olympians and they decide to destroy the world through a great deluge, right? And in particular, they're targeting the Atlanteans who have rebelled against Olympus. So the Devas, the gods, are aligned with Angra Minu or Ahriman. Notice now the Gnostic structure is already becoming clear. These heavenly powers that stand between us and the true divine intelligence of the cosmos. So the Devas are the archons. Wow. Zarathustra's take on the Devas, or Devs, they are the archons. They're the prototype for the Gnostic archon.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And I'm with Dr. Reza Jorjani today, author of Prometheism and Lovers of Sophia. And guys, this is once in a while I get him on. Last time he was on, everybody loved it. So we're going to go deep this time into Zoroaster and the roots of Gnosticism. You might not know, the roots of Gnosticism are not in Greco-Roman world. They're in the East. They're in Persia. And we're about to demonstrate that in this conversation. So how are you doing today?
It's great to be with you, Neil. I had been meaning to come back on the show earlier, and I do occasionally watch your programs, and really looking forward to this opportunity to familiarize your audience with potentially the Persian origins of Gnosticism.
Yeah, this will be fun. So why don't we start with Zoroaster? Why don't we start with, who is he? What is his teachings? There's the Gathas, there's the Ascendavesta. What is it? Let's get to the start of all this and who this guy is. What time period? All that. Right.
So the Gathas are a text that's been, extremely controversial and polarizing in the scholarly community, not only within Iranology or Iranian studies itself, but in the broader field of Indo-European studies. There's been great controversy about the date of this text. And but let me just start with its name for a minute. Gatha, okay, so of course the language in which this text is composed, this ancient Iranian language, is a sister language of Sanskrit. In fact, it's very close to Sanskrit, and this factors into the dating debates over this text. So the word Gatha is a cognate of the word Gita. So Gita, like Bhagavad Gita, Gatha is a cognate of Gita, and it's related to the word Goth in the Germanic languages. Wow. So Gothic, Gita, and Gathas are all related, and they have something to do with a hymn of praise. Okay, and having to do with the divine, with God. Gott in German means God, right? Wow. And Gita means sort of a song of praise or hymn of praise. So that's the meaning of the word for this text, the name of this text, and it brings us into the question of dating it based on its linguistics. So wow. The problem is that this language that the Gathas is composed in, and it was believed by some to have been an oral text that was only subsequently written down. I'll tell you why I don't agree with that. But this language is very close to Rig Vedic, okay? So it's like a really ancient form of similar to an ancient form of Sanskrit, much older than the Sanskrit of the Bhagavad Gita, older than the younger Upanishads. And so people have assumed, some scholars have, that it dates from like 1500 to 1000 BC. So either slightly older or slightly older than or contemporaneous with the Upanishads, and or with the Vedas, somewhere between the Vedas and the Upanishads. But the problem is that if you compare the Gathas to the Vedas, the level of philosophical complexity in this text and the first person narrative style of it doesn't mesh at all with Rigvedic culture. Stylistically, what you find in the Gathas is very much of a piece with pre-Socratic philosophy. It reads like Parmenides or Heraclitus or something like that. Okay, it's a profoundly philosophical text, very complex conceptually, and it's also written in the first person, which makes it in a way even more modern than the pre-Socratic Greeks.
Right.
This is like a guy telling you what he thinks about the world and even mentioning his friends and stuff that he's been through in his life, and not at all in this anonymous mythic, style of composition that we find in the Upanishads or even in Homer or any text of that degree of antiquity. It's almost modern in its style. It's like the idiom that you start to find in classical Athens, and then that becomes very popular in the Roman Empire. Okay, so for that reason, I really question, dating this to 1000 to 1500 BC. I also question it because there's a big religious conflict that's depicted in this text. Zarathustra is a rebel against some existing priestly order. He is basically engaging in a kind of spiritual philosophical insurrection against both ritualistic sacrificial priests and these warlord princes. And he calls these the katapon. Katapon is a word that becomes korban later. It means sacrifice, sacrificial, mumbling priests, he calls them. And he means like the way they mindlessly recite all these, hymns and mantras and so forth.
Yeah.
And then these warlord princes called the Kavis. And so, people have assumed this refers to Rigvedic priests and the Rigvedic Kshatriya or princely class. But actually, if you look in the details of the text, you see it fits much more the context of Scythian Mithraism, the kind of, as he describes them, mad, drunken warlords that go on cattle raids that are the backdrop for the message of the Gathas, fit the Scythian warlords who were coming down into the Persian and Median territories around 700, 600 BC, and raiding the farmlands of the settled population in Persia and Media.
And just to budget it real quick, in case anyone doesn't know, archaeology reflects how widespread these Mithraic temples and places were, from Britain all the way to like Siberia, basically in the Bronze Age. But yeah, I just wanted to just throw that in there.
Yeah. And let me just also throw in a note on a completely different tangent. If anyone hears background noise, I must apologize. I'm in New York City, and being in Manhattan in particular, one of the things you have to deal with is constant construction. There's a huge, hopefully they're going to be on their lunch break right now and we won't have to deal with them, but we'll see. Yeah. In any case, so the backdrop of Zarathustra is ancient Iranian Mithraism, if you ask me. That's what the details of the Gathas really align with. And also we have to consider two events in this man's life. One, his self-exile. Apparently, his message was so revolutionary and he was so badly persecuted for it wherever he was born and raised that he had to migrate over a long distance and accept the patronage of this king called Vishtaspa, this feudal lord or petty king called Vishtaspa, Kavi Vishtaspa, or Ke-Goshtasp in the later Persian. And it appears that the court of Ke-Goshtasp was in present-day Khurasan, that's northeastern Iran, right under Turkmenistan and next to Afghanistan, next to the Afghan border. And so point being, he wasn't from there, okay? there's a debate over where he was from as well. But if that's where Gustav's court was, then he came to there from somewhere else, and it lends more credence to the Zoroastrian biographies, later written Zoroastrian biographies that suggest he was from Azerbaijan, from the province of Iran known as Azerbaijan, the ancient name of which was Azarpadagan, meaning the bastion of the fire. And it was a mainly Median territory, and the Magi were the traditional priests of the Medes. So that makes sense. And it makes sense that this guy pissed off Mithraic priests in Media, Greater Media, and he had to basically go into self-exile, flee for his life to Khorasan, to northeastern Iran, going towards Central Asia. And so, okay, why is this relevant to the date? Because Zarathustra is killed in some kind of an invasion by people called Turanian in the Shahnameh, in the Iranian national epic. These people are called Turanians. They come from a place called Turan, which is in Central Asia. And this is another name for the Sakas, or the Scythian people. They were descended from a guy called Tur. And so one name for them are the Turanians. We know them in the West as the Scythians. When was there a Scythian rampage like this of Khorasan, where someone like Zarathustra could have been killed? It took place in about, let's say, it was the time when Cyrus the Great had overthrown the Median kingdom, and the Median kingdom, its border had come right up against Central Asia, okay? And so right up against Scythian territory. And when Cyrus the Great, the founder of, the first Persian Empire, when he overthrew his grandfather, Astyages of Media, there was this vacuum of power briefly where there was chaos. Nobody knew who was really in charge. And so the Scythians came down and they overran the Medes and the Persians for a brief period of time. So it looks like this puts Zarathustra at the date which, the Zoroastrians themselves claimed he lived. They say that conventional Zoroastrian scriptures say that Zarathustra was 258 years before Alexander. Wow. And what they mean is 258 years, not before the birth of Alexander, but before the coming of Alexander to Iran, before his invasion of the Persian Empire. And so that puts Zarathustra in the generation before Cyrus. So, so this means that Zarathustra was an old man at the time when Cyrus the Great had overthrown, Astyages of Media and was trying to form the Persian Empire. So those dates all align perfectly. And that also puts us right at the dawn of philosophy, right? I mean, these pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, immediately before him, Pythagoras, and so forth, Parmenides after Heraclitus, these are all in the 500s, okay, 500s BC.
Explosion of intellect.
Exactly. So if you put Zarathustra in 1500 or 1000 BC, it doesn't make any sense in terms of the intellectual context. I mean, he would be a total anomaly. If you put Zarathustra at, let's see, what would it be? It would be 628 BC. If we go by the conventional Zoroastrian dating, he would have been born in 628 BC. And that means that considering the fact they claim he composed the Gathas in his 40s, it would have been around 580 BC when Zarathustra composed the Gathas. Well, that's perfect. That would mean that Zarathustra was the first pre-Socratic philosopher. He has the distinction of being the first. And he would then have immediately influenced the subsequent pre-Socratic thinkers, especially as we're going to discuss Pythagoras and Heraclitus. And he would have influenced them by virtue of the fact that the Persian Empire conquered Ionia, which was the Greek bastion of philosophy. So I think this is the proper matrix for dating Zarathustra.
I think that also puts him in the same timeline as people like Isaiah and Hosea. And and that's interesting because that's a time period where the world just kind of shifts in its paradigm for all these ideas. But my question is, before we continue, is why do people think that he's born in 1500 BC? What is it? Where did that even come from? Do you know?
Yeah, linguistics alone. And so let me say one other thing about this. there is no other evidence based really, upon which to base this thesis other than linguistics. In other words, the fact that the idiom of the Gathas is
So it's very ancient.
similar to Rig Vedic Sanskrit. Okay, but look at Latin.
Yeah.
So, we have René Descartes in the 1600s, late 1500s, early 1600s, early 1600s. We have René Descartes composing in Latin.
That's true.
Latin was used by, scholars throughout the whole Middle Ages, 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, and of Latin having been used as a living spoken language. So, okay,
And
Latin
before the Common Era, Cicero was writing in Latin.
Exactly. So Latin was a dead language for 1,000 years or more.
What?
By the time that it was still being used as a language that would confer a degree of scholastic authority on a person composing a text, either theological or intellectual authority was conveyed by composing in this dead language of Latin. So why wouldn't we think that a Mede or Persian, it's debatable which Zarathustra was, he was an Iranian in any case, these are two different branches of the Iranian family, the Medes and the Persians, and the Scythians. These were the three major branches, okay, of the Iranian family in those days. So why would we not think that a Mede or a Persian might use this dead language, which was the language of the Magi, and of the Rig Vedic priests, to confer authority upon the text that he was composing? Whereas it wasn't his spoken living language. For all we know, the guy spoke Persian.
Good point. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So now that now we're in the time period, we sort of understand the context, and let's go from there. What stems from this sort of age of Zarathustra?
Right. So his message is absolutely revolutionary. To understand that, we need to just take a quick look again, or have a refresher, because your audience, I'm sure, is largely familiar with this. But let's just have a refresher of the basics of Greek theology, ancient Greek theology, and how it lines up with the other end of the Indo-European spectrum, namely Vedic theology. So one thing that the Greeks and their Eastern brothers still agreed on round about 600 BC was that the beings worthy of worship are these gods, right? The Greeks, worship these Olympian gods, and in the Vedic pantheon, you have their analog in terms of the Devas, led by Indra, and Indra is Zeus. Right. Okay, it's a very direct.
Dies Pater
is Dies Pater is Indra, and so the Olympian pantheon and the Vedic pantheon are very much the same, and they devolved from a primordial Indo-European religion, a single primordial Indo-European religion. We know this through linguistics and anthropology and archaeology.
Just the fact that Dies Pater shows up in Spain and Italy, and also all the way in India, there you go. You have a clear something to look at. You have tangible something to look at that shows you this is a widespread ancient language that's spread across the entire hemisphere.
Yeah, he's a thunderbolt wielding sky father, warlord deity. That's Indra or Zeus. And he leads this pantheon, okay? And there are these sacrificial priests who are orienting all of human worship toward this pantheon, and humanity has this subservient, not to say servile, relationship to these gods who are extremely tyrannical and capricious and, frankly, at times sadistic. And this is true both in Greek religion and ancient Vedic religion. And then there's another class of beings that you see both in Greek religion and Vedic religion, and those are the Titans. And these Titans are opposed to the gods. The Vedic people called them Asuras. And this is very significant because the chief deity of Zarathustra is Ahura Mazda. And Ahura, just like, Gita and Gatha, Ahura is the Iranian cognate of the Vedic Ashura. So Ahura Mazda, Mazda means wisdom. Ahura Mazda is the Titan or the Ashura of wisdom. So right away, what Zarathustra is doing is inverting the entire theological worldview of the Indo-Europeans 180 degrees. He preaches in the Gathas that the Devas are sadistic, tyrannical, and above all, deceptive. He says that their chief attribute is duruj, or the lie. They're great deceivers, and they're oppressors of mankind. And above all, they're trying to deny us wisdom and knowledge. So we ought to align ourselves with titanic wisdom and rebel against these gods. So it's a message of insurrection that we find in the Gathas. Insurrection against the entire heavenly order, which was common to the Greeks and the Vedic people. Okay? So you can see why this guy had to flee for his life.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
So,
who would if Ahura Mazda which is there a god in the ancient Greek pantheon that relates to?
hell yeah, there is. Hell yeah, there is.
Can I guess? Is it Uranos?
No.
Okay.
But it's interesting because I'll say something about Uranos later in a moment, in response to this. But okay, so let's lay this out really briefly for a minute. And I'm going to come back to these attributes of Ahura Mazda momentarily, but just to answer your question. First of all, we've got the name Titan of Wisdom. Okay, who's a Titan? Who's associated with wisdom? Second, the chief attribute of Ahura Mazda is forward thinking or thinking ahead. Spenta Mainyu, and I'll come back to this. Thinking, whoa, wait a minute, thinking ahead. And number three, what is the element that symbolizes cosmic order? That's an expression of the mind of Ahura Mazda. Fire, an ever-burning fire.
I got it.
Oh, okay. So who is Ahura Mazda? Prometheus.
Yeah.
Okay. Clearly, Ahura Mazda is a philosophical concept that's been developed on the basis of an older Indo-European myth of Prometheus, which you find in its original form not in Greece but in Iran.
He's the creator too.
Yeah, and he's the creator. He's the creator of mankind. Okay, he's the creator. He created us in his image.
People forget about that.
To think for ourselves and not to worship these tyrannical Olympians. We'll come back to that.
Sure.
But the myth of Prometheus, a lot of people might not realize, doesn't come from Greece. It comes from Iran originally. The whole Caucasus was part of Iran until the Russian czars took it from Iran in the 1800s.
Wow, that's a long time.
Okay, so the Caucasus is the cradle of Iranian civilization. And the myth of Prometheus in its original form is still found in the Caucasus in terms of the cult of Amirani. There's this figure called Amirani, and he's clearly, if you look at the structure of the myth, he's Prometheus, and they still worship him in the folk religion of Georgia. And there are statues of him in the countrysides of Georgia and the Caucasus Mountains, where, of course, Prometheus is chained. In the myth, Prometheus, when he's punished by Zeus, he's chained to the Caucasus Mountains, right? And so the whole ancient Indo-European fire cult of Prometheus, I believe, was the raw material with which Zarathustra was working when he developed this philosophically complex notion of Ahura Mazda.
That's fascinating.
But I mentioned forethought. So Ahura Mazda emanates 7 powers or 7 facets of his divine intelligence. And these are called the Amesha Spentas. And the fact that it's 7 is going to be relevant to our discussion of Zarathustra's influence on Gnosticism. Okay, so bear that in mind. So there are these 7 powers, and the foremost of these is Spenta Mainyu, which, as I mentioned, is translated into Greek as Prometheia, forward thinking, thinking ahead. The progressive mentality is one good translation of it. Spenta, progressive, forward-oriented, Mainyu, mentality, mind. Spenta Mainyu. And this is the foremost of the 7 powers that express, Ahura Mazda in the cosmos. The second one is something called Asha Vahishta. And Asha became Arta in the language of the Persian Empire. And this means cosmic order. It's basically the Greek notion cosmos, which, by the way, had not been formed yet at that time. It's going to be formed, as we'll discuss, in Heraclitus. So this notion of cosmic order is the second manifestation of this, of Ahura Mazda, Asha Vahishta. It means the best order, literally. That's the translation of it. Asha, order, Vahishta, the best, namely cosmic order. Then we've got, and very significantly, let me not gloss over the fact that Asha Vahishta is symbolized by fire. That's the ever-burning fire, which always changes its forms, but it's the same substrate. In other words, energy. Energy, the cosmos is basically as ever-transforming energy.
Is this that monad that people attribute to his teachings?
We'll get into that. I think that in my view, Zarathustra is neither a monist nor a dualist.
Okay.
His view is more nuanced than that. But I think that his view influenced both monism and it influenced both the Valentinian type of Gnosticism and also the Manichaean dualistic type of Gnosticism. Okay, so then the third one after Asha Vahishta, we could say is Vohumana. And Vohumana means the best thinking, the best thinking. And notice humana in Vohumana, humana, becomes humanitas. Vohumana, the best thinking, is the means whereby we become truly human. Unless you cultivate Vohumana, you're not really a human being. You're an animal that walks on two legs. Okay, so this notion that became prominent in the Roman Empire of humanitas being something that is not necessarily inherent, shouldn't be taken for granted, but something that has to be, cultivated. This is a notion that goes back to Zarathustra's concept of Vohumana, one of the 7 Amesha Spentas or emanations of Ahura Mazda. Then we've got Haurvatat, and so there's a certain internal logic to this. When you cultivate Vohumana, or the best thinking, you are aligning yourself with Asha Vahishta, with cosmic order. And when you align yourself with cosmic order through the best thinking, then you also wind up becoming a vehicle or channel for the progressive force in the cosmos, namely Spenta Mainyu. This progressive mentality starts to become the dominant spirit of your life as you align yourself with cosmic order through the best thinking. That's how Spenta Mainyu, Asha Vahishta, and Vohumana are connected. And then when you start to come into this alignment through the cultivation of, your human potential for rationality, and intellection, then you attain a series of other attributes. One of them is Haurvatat, which means wholeness. Wholeness in the sense that the word health used to mean, to be hale or whole. And this kind of wholeness was symbolized by water in, early Zoroastrianism, which I think is where the baptism idea comes from in Christianity. This baptism, submersion in water as a symbol of conferring wholeness upon a person. Then another attribute that follows from cultivating the best thinking is Ameratat, which is often translated as immortality. And people connect this to the Taoist notion of longevity. But actually the word Ameratat means deathlessness. Meratat, mer is like a cognate of, mort in French, or, it's our word for mortality. You can see how it, meratat, mortality, right? So it's a meratat, a mortality, deathlessness.
Immortal.
Immortal, right? But it could just mean vitality. Right? But coming from out of the power and grip of death and being very vital. So vitality and wholeness coming from cultivating the best thinking. And then
this is where you get the idea of apotheosis later on in these Gnostics.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then you have Spenta Armaiti, which is tranquility, serenity, poise, kind of, deep grace and groundedness. And whereas Ameratat is symbolized by vegetation, Spenta Mainyu is symbolized by the earth, the element of earth. So grounded serenity and tranquility coming from being well-rooted through, the cultivation of the best thinking and the wholeness or health and vitality that comes from it. And then finally, Vohu Khashatra is the last of these 7 attributes or emanations of Ahura Mazda, and that means the best dominion, or the ideal governance, or the most righteous form of rule. And so this is another thing which, if we can keep it in mind to come back to, is important in terms of teasing out the distinctions between Zarathustra's teaching and the various forms of Gnosticism that were deeply influenced by it. Because in Gnosticism, and we can flesh this out later, there is this inherent critique of power, where all power is archontic, and generally all political regimes are inherently bound for corruption and so forth. Not so in Zarathustra's vision. In Zarathustra is the first utopian, and he believes that there can be an ideal form of government based on the governance of the wise, from which Plato later gets his idea of the philosopher kings and so on and so forth.
Right.
These are the 7 major attributes of the teachings of Zarathustra. But there's other points I want to get to that we find in the Gathas as well. But just if you want to have any reflections and commentary on that before we continue.
Let's see. So yeah, so he's spreading these ideas, and how do we get from that to having like separate different forms of Gnosticism that spread as far as Greece? Like, how do these ideas get fleshed out?
Yeah, okay. So before we head to the influence on, and let me just lay out a few other important points, okay? Because they're going to be vital to the impact of Zarathustra's thinking on Gnosticism. One is that there's a counterforce to, I was about to say to Ahura Mazda, because this is how the Gnostics interpret this counterforce. But really, it's a counterforce to Spenta Mainyu, to this, the 7th power, or the main attribute of Ahura Mazda, and that counterforce is called Angra Mainyu. So you have Spenta Mainyu and Angra Mainyu, and this Angra Mainyu is later contracted linguistically to Ahriman.
Right.
So Angra Mainyu literally means the constricted, constrained mentality. Angira in Persian means knotted up, like. And
for anyone doesn't, this influences Christianity big time with the devil. And there's a passage in Matthew where Jesus is in the wilderness and he's being tempted by the devil. And I'm not even kidding. If you look at the Zendavesta, the passage lines up almost verbatim, where it's the same thing. You have Zoroaster in the wilderness chanting, doing his thing. And then all of a sudden Spenta Mainyu comes out and was like, hey, if you worship me, I'll give you the boon to rule all the...
Angra Mainyu.
Yeah. He goes, I'll give you the boon to rule all the nations. And then, of course, Zoroaster just keeps chanting to Ahura Mazda, and Angra Mainyu is rushed away, pushed off. This story really influences how Jesus is portrayed in Matthew. And by the way, it just happens to be the same book that starts off with Magi chasing a star to find, like, there can't be a coincidence. This is a highly, people think Matthew is a Jewish book. I don't see it. I think it's just Eastern book. I guess that would make more sense, right?
There's a lot that could be said about all of that. Yeah, I'll try to come back to it.
Sure.
In particular to the devil, okay? Because the devil's in the details.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Angra Mainyu, right? What is this Angra Mainyu? Gere, constrained, constricted. This is the force or counterforce that is constraining progress, is suffocating life, is constricting our flourishing, right? So it's a force of how can I put it? Stagnation and stasis and retardation, actually. Okay, and so one important thing about this Angra Mainyu notion that becomes Ahriman in Middle Persian is that it means Ahura Mazda is not omnipotent. Okay, he's neither omnipotent nor omniscient. And this is really important because many theologians have recognized, and on account of this fact, Zoroastrianism doesn't face the problem of evil. In any religion where you have an omniscient and omnipotent God, there's the problem of God being responsible for all the evil in the world. And if, in my view, more importantly, the fact that you don't have any free will. You cannot have free will and have an omnipotent and omniscient God. It just doesn't work, okay? It's completely illogical. And any jackass like St. Augustine who wants to say that it's a miracle, I'm not going to give him the time of day, all right? So you got to choose between your omniscient God, omnipotent God, on the one hand, and free will on the other. Zarathustra doesn't face that problem. Ahura Mazda is limited. The power and even the knowledge of Ahura Mazda is limited by this counterforce. And this means we have free will. We have the free will radically to choose between these two forces and which one we want to align ourselves with. And that's a message you find at the core of the Gathas. Zarathustra repeatedly says, and emphatically so, you, with your own intellect, observe, discern, and choose which of the forces you want to align yourself with, either Spenta Mainyu or Angra Mainyu. And to go back to the beginning of our discussion, the Devas are aligned with Angra Mainyu. Okay? Right. So, and he specifically says this in the Gathas. There is this very strange passage in the Gathas, which, if you ask me, aligns with the myth of Atlantis that you find in Plato. And with some things in the Vedic context, in terms of the Mahabharata's accounts of the ancient wars between the Devas and the Asuras and so forth, there is a strange passage in the Gathas where Zarathustra says that when the Devas were deliberating, Angra Mainyu came in, and he, as a great deceiver, confused their deliberations, and they rushed in wrath and destroyed the life of mankind. Well, what is this talking about? This is talking about when Zeus calls a convocation of the Olympians, and they decide to destroy the world through a great deluge, right? And in particular, they're targeting the Atlanteans, who have rebelled against Olympus. So the Devas, the gods, are aligned with Angra Mainyu or Ahriman. And we have the free choice to be able to basically resist these heavenly powers that, notice now the Gnostic structure is already becoming clear. These heavenly powers that stand between us and the true divine intelligence of the cosmos.
Archons.
Yeah. So the Devas are the Archons. Wow. Zarathustra's take on the Devas, or Devs, it's where we get the word devil from, Devs, right? The Devas, they are the Archons. They're the prototype for the Gnostic Archons, who stand between us and our alignment with the divine intelligence, in the cosmos.
Wow. Yes. Now, the more you talk about it, the more it's starting to look a lot clearer of how these ideas line up.
One last very important piece of the message of the Gathas that's going to become fundamental to Gnosticism, and that's the idea that, well, two more. Yes. One is that this choice, this free choice that we have, has to be exercised within a certain time frame. Zarathustra is the first person in recorded history to have a teleological conception of time. So all of these ancient cultures, the Greek culture, the Vedic culture, the Mayan culture, ancient Egyptian, etc., everywhere across the entire globe, you had cyclical conceptions of time, where there were a series of world ages that you'd go through, from the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, etc., Iron Age, or the Greek, Satya Yuga, all the way to the Kali Yuga, and then the cycle would repeat itself, right? Zarathustra says, no, there is a successive series of world ages that are in a progressive trajectory toward an end of history. That's an apocalypse. And this end of history is a final judgment between the forces of wisdom and the forces of ignorance and retardation, between the forward momentum of creation and regression, retardation, and basically the power of death. And so we have to make our choice before this final event. And this final event is symbolized by the entire globe being engulfed in flame. Okay, the world being set ablaze, which is an alchemical metaphor. right? It's the alchemical fire transmuting this world into a more perfect form. And they call this the Freshgard. Well, this is what Zarathustra calls it in the Gathas in its original form, Frasho Kereti, and it becomes Freshgard in Middle Persian. Literally, if you can hear the word fresh in that, Freshgard, Frasho Kereti, fresh. Right. So it's the refreshing of the world. It's like hitting the refresh button on a browser, right? It's the refreshing of the world. And it's accomplished through this alchemical fire. And on the other side of that, everything attains its perfect form. So this brings us then to the last idea, which is key to Gnosticism. And that's that there are these farvahas or fravashis that are the perfect forms of everything in the world. And they pre-exist the created world. Now, notice, we're like 200 years before Plato here, okay? So this idea that, as I'm going to point to if we have the time, Plato gets via Pythagoras from Zarathustra, this idea of the archetypes, pre-existing physical creation on the basis of them is also central to the message of Zarathustra, and it becomes key to Gnosticism. This is the notion of the pleroma, or some etheric, whatever, non-physical realm where there are more perfect forms of beings in this world. So the pleroma notion in its embryonic form is there in the Gathas of Zarathustra. And there's an idea that after the Freshgard, after this fiery, apocalypse, this world, this physical world, is going to more perfectly instantiate or embody this archetypal reality. And in particular, in terms of our human existence, each person who passes that trial by fire will embody his Dana. Dana is a word that Zarathustra uses, which is a cognate of the Greek dianoia, and it becomes the basis for two words in later Persian, dana, which means knowing, and dain, which means duty. So think knowing and duty. So the word dana meant conscience in the teaching of Zarathustra, and it was symbolized by a maiden who you would meet after death. And this maiden, like a Valkyrie, right? This maiden was your perfect form, your anima, Is
this where Diana comes from? The goddess?
I think so, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Okay. Well, I'll tell you why right now, okay? Because who is Diana? Diana is the Roman form of Artemis. Yeah. Artemis has no meaning in Greek. We know, Herodotus and other Greek writers say that the cult of Artemis was the religion of the Amazons, and they're the ones who brought it to Greece. The Amazons built the temple of Artemis. The Amazons are Iranians, okay? Yeah. The Amazons are Sarmatians. They're Sarmatian women, and they had a matriarchal society. And so we have to look for the meaning of Artemis in Iranian languages, not in Greek. And Artemis has a very clear meaning in Iranian languages. It's Arta Amesha. As I mentioned earlier, Arta is a Persian form of Asha, cosmic order, or truth. Truth is another translation of Asha or Arta. And then Amesha, like remember the Amesha Spentas. Right. The Amesha Spentas, the 7 emanations of Zarathustra, of Ahura Mazda. Amesha means undying or immortal, and Spenta is the sort of like the spirits, right? The immortal spirits. So Arta Amesha, Artemis, Arta Amesha means immortal truth or immortal cosmic order. And this is who Artemis really is. She's an embodiment of immortal cosmic order in a feminine form coming from out of a matriarchal Iranian society. So do I think Diana is related to Dana? Yeah, I do think it's, via Artemis.
That is so true, yeah. I don't think you can deny it. I think you just laid it out perfectly. I don't think you can even deny it.
And by the way, the chief attribute of, attribute is not necessarily the right word, but like she's known as a huntress who's associated with archery in particular.
The oldest myth in the world is the wild hunt.
the Iranians were known as the greatest archers of the ancient world. Herodotus says the Iranians taught their kids three things: one, telling the truth; two, horseback riding; and three, archery.
Right.
Okay. Speak the truth and shoot well with arrows. That is Persian virtue, quote unquote. That's Friedrich Nietzsche.
And even Alexander the Great, if you read Arrian, before he even went to Persia in the east, he battled with the Scythians, and he recruited thousands of their archers to even go to Persia. He probably couldn't even do that unless he did that first.
Yeah, they were the greatest ballistics people in the ancient world, the Iranians in general, Scythians and Persians both.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, so you got this Dana. She's like this Valkyrie who's your most perfect form. And also her name becomes the word for knowledge in Persian later, Dana. And so this is Sophia. It's your inner Sophia.
Wow.
Okay. And you're supposed to become her after the end of history. After the apocalypse, we become, which is kind of bizarre because this is like it's very strange. It's an uber matriarchal conception because it's saying that both men and women have this inner feminine perfect form, and that after the end of the world, like we're all going to embody that.
The Old Testament too, in Proverbs 8, where it talks about Sophia first formed the father, totally switches everything on its head. Like Adam was created by a female now. Like which one is it? But I think that's how you get these medieval Kabbalists. That's what they're interpreting later on. But anyway, that's a whole different story. But yeah, I'm basically saying this is reflective in other parts of theology and philosophy.
Yeah, and it's the Gnostic, what becomes the Gnostic destruction of the fallen world and the emergence of the Pleroma as our primary form of existence, and our embodying Sophia at the end of history. And it's all right there already in the Gathas and 580 BC.
Wow.
Okay, so that lays out for us the basic message of the Gathas. And now we can finally address this question that you raised, or maybe you want to raise anew, about the influence of Zarathustra or Zoroaster on, and by the way, let me just mention this guy's name. Like, what is this? Why some people call him Zoroaster? Why is he called Zarathustra in?
Yeah, that's a good question.
People assume the Greeks came up with this Zoroaster as a corruption of Zarathustra, because Zoroaster means Zara, or Zar in Persian, means gold, and Aster, of course, is the word for star. Setare still means star in Persian, and so Zoroaster means golden star. But this is probably a corruption. Because Zarathustra calls himself Zarathustra in the Gathas, and that's the whole Iranian tradition refers to him as that. And then later, when Iranology becomes sophisticated in Europe in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, you have the correct name Zarathustra reemerge, and that's why Nietzsche uses the correct name of Zarathustra rather than Zoroaster. And Zarathustra means not golden star, but golden camel. Ushtara is camel. Later becomes the word shotor. Ushtara or shotor in contemporary Persian means camel. So his name meant golden camel. And back in that time when he was alive, the two most prized animals were horses and camels. And you found a lot of people with an name ending aspa, like Zarathustra's own friend Jamaspa, the king that became his patron, Visht Aspa. Aspa means horse, and Ushtara means camel. So you had people named so-and-so camel or so-and-so horse. And so his name means golden camel.
That's interesting you said that, because I'm learning Greek right now, and my Greek teacher was just telling me that if you every time you see the str in a word, this comes from a family. It's a certain family of linguistic words that have like a root somewhere. It's like real deep in mythology, I guess. But and also as far as the camels go, you could see why camels would be so valuable, because you can put tons of items on their back and travel long distances without having to carry it. Like traders needed camels.
That's right. That's right. And of course, in this case, we're talking not about, because your viewers are going to think Iran, whatever, Middle East. No, we're not talking about Arabian camels here. We're talking about the Central Asian camel.
Right.
Zarathustra was living up towards Central Asia. So we're talking about the Central Asian camel. In any case, that's irrelevant. Yeah. So the influence of Zarathustra. So Pythagoras, okay. Pythagoras is the first philosopher.
He's like the Abraham of the Greeks.
Well, God's forbid that we should ever compare him to Abraham. Look, this is, even from a Gnostic perspective, utter heresy, right?
Okay.
Abraham was a child murdering, mindless zombie listening to a psychopathic voice from heaven, and Pythagoras was a torchbearer of wisdom and enlightenment for humanity. But I take your point, meaning like he's the forerunner of the entire
father of everything, right?
Tradition in Greece. Because nobody used the word philosophy before Pythagoras, or the word philosopher. He's the one who coins the term. And whereas the word philosopher or philosophy didn't exist in Greek, it did in ancient Iranian. Zarathustra wasn't a Zoroastrian, and he didn't call his doctrine Zoroastrianism. He called it Mazda Yasna, which means reverence for wisdom. And a person following it was a Mazda Yasin, a reverer of wisdom. And in particular, in the teaching of Zarathustra, you do not worship Ahura Mazda. You are a friend of Ahura Mazda. That's the term that he uses.
Wow.
You choose to be a friend of Ahura Mazda, and the relationship to the wisdom, the Titanic wisdom, is a relationship of friendship. So philosophia. Philia means friendship in Greek, and Sophia means wisdom. So Pythagoras is just translating Mazda Yasna into Greek when he coins the term philosophy or the term philosopher. And we know this is the case because the man spent a decade, more than a decade, in the capital of the Persian Empire. When Pythagoras was young, he went to Egypt, and while he was in Egypt, studying with the priests and measuring the pyramid, measuring the inside of the king's chamber to get the Pythagorean theorem and so on and so forth, he was arrested by the military forces of Cambyses II. Cambyses II was the son of Cyrus the Great. He was the second emperor of the Persian Empire. And as a joke, he had Pythagoras arrested the way that in Plato's Republic, there's the scene at the beginning where Socrates is arrested by his friends. In other words, they force him to come and have a philosophical discussion with them. They're like, we're not going to let you go, man. You're going to come and you're going to talk to us. And we're going to pick your brains and get some wisdom out of your head.
Like what I'm doing with you right now.
Well, maybe. in any case. So they grab this guy and they say that, listen, the king really wants to talk to you. Please come back with us, whether you want it or not. You're coming back with us to Babylon, to the capital of the Persian Empire. And, we want you to sit with the Magi and the king and, talk to us. And so he goes back with them, and he spends 10 to 12 years.
That's what I've heard, yep.
Over a decade, studying with, and I think probably to some extent it was a two-way relationship, working with the Magi, okay, the Zoroastrian priests in the capital of the Persian Empire, 12 years.
Now, I'm not sure if you know about this, but among the stuff that's found from Marcus Aurelius in his writings, he's got Greek translations of Zoroaster. And I'm wondering, this is maybe through Pythagoras somehow it gets passed down, or is he?
No doubt.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm sure these writings were common both in the Pythagorean schools and also in the Platonic Academy, ultimately. And the reason they didn't get to us is because of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, right, and Corinth and various other places, where these libraries were torched. So look, and by the way, let me just, this is not a side note. This is actually really relevant. One way we know that's true, and I'm just not making some anti-Christian claim, like, off the top of my head or pulling it out of somewhere, is because we know there was this guy, Anacharsis of Scythia, who was another one living around the time of Zarathustra, between Zarathustra and Pythagoras. And he was a Scythian by paternal descent, whose mother was Greek. And he went from Scythia, in other words, from northern Iran, to Athens, where he became friends with Solon. And he was also known as one of the most, in fact, besides Zarathustra, Anacharsis is the first pre-Socratic philosopher. And he had a notorious reputation, this guy did. He was basically a philosophical anarchist, and we can come back to this. A a lot of what becomes the teaching of Gautama Buddha, I think, is deeply influenced by Anacharsis of Scythia. A lot of what becomes Taoism, deeply influenced by Anacharsis of Scythia's deconstruction of polar opposites and his critique of emergent rationality, and his old notion of basically, nature as a flux, and the dynamic interplay of opposites, and the lack of any objective criteria for making judgments about things. He was like a proto-cynic in a lot of ways.
Wow.
And okay, and he was Iranian, all right? He's coming from the same cultural milieu as Zarathustra. But here's the thing. There are no writings of his that have survived. This guy wrote a shit ton. People quoted him in various books, and we don't have anything from Anacharsis of Scythia. Therefore, go ahead.
You said he met Solon, the lawgiver?
He was friends with him. He was personal friends with him. Solon said, he came and he said to Solon, hey, I came here to be your friend. I think we could really, have a profitable relationship. Solon said to him, it's best to make friends at home. Get lost, man. Well, you're some foreigner, get the hell out of here. And he said, well, since you're at home, you should make friends with me. And anyway, the two of them struck up. Yeah, in Athens, yeah.
Okay.
He moved to Athens. He was an Iranian who moved to Athens.
Because there is a story that Solon goes to Heliopolis, and because that was where the great library was before Alexandria. Yeah. And so this is after that?
I'm not sure when in Solon's life it was, whether it was before he went to Egypt or after he went to Egypt or at what point.
But that's still fascinating that he has it.
Well, I can tell you, it was in 589 BC. So people familiar with the life of Solon, they can figure out whether it was before or after he went to Egypt. But
leave it in the comments. There you go.
Yeah. So, but just notice the date here. Anacharsis came to Athens in 589 BC. When was the likely date that Zarathustra composed the Gathas? 580 BC. So this is within 9 years.
Wow. So now we can start pinpointing when things happen now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is, it makes a lot of sense. Zarathustra would have been at this time and would have been a major catalytic force for the rise of pre-Socratic philosophy. In any case, why did I bring up Anacharsis? Yeah, it's obvious we lost a lot of these writings, and that there were definitely texts by Zarathustra other than the Gathas and other, I hesitate to call them Zoroastrian texts of Mazda Yasna, Iranian wisdom, translated into Greek, which were in these libraries and which we lost through the catastrophic rise of the Catholic Church and so forth. But in any case, okay, we got sidetracked. Pythagoras.
Yeah.
So he studies for a dozen years in the capital of the Persian Empire with the Magi, the priests who have adopted the doctrine of Zarathustra. So obviously, this guy, he's got to have been under massive influence from the teaching of Zarathustra. And you can see it reflected in Pythagoras' teaching. He has this notion of peras and apeiron, that there are these two principles that work in the cosmos. One is a principle of order. This is what, when he says everything is number, right? Pythagoras is saying there is this principle of limit and limitation and demarcation, peras. And what it is demarcating and limiting is apeiron, a chaotic unlimited. Okay, and this chaotic unlimited is it's like a vortex. It's like a black hole. Like, the event horizon of a black hole tears everything apart, right? So this is like Angra Mainyu. This is like the force of chaos and disorder. So you see this at the heart of the ontology of Pythagoras. You also see that Pythagoras, and I neglected to mention this earlier in terms of Zarathustra, but I'm coming back to it now. Pythagoras has a exceptional respect for women and a promotion of the bizarre notion at the time, the radically countercultural notion that women should have equality of opportunity. He took women as students into the Pythagorean school, and some of them rose to be teachers in the Pythagorean order. And this is something you find in the Gathas of Zarathustra as well. Zarathustra, this is unheard. In 600 BC, this guy is talking about the equality of women and how women have conscience and rationality and should make their own choices in life. And he officiates at his daughter's wedding and gives this whole sermon about how her life is her own and she should make her own choices and so on and so forth.
And this could possibly be from this Dana idea from Zoroaster.
Yeah, and let's not forget. A whole third of the Iranian community or a fourth of the Iranian community in those days, the Sarmatians, were a matriarchal society who became the basis for the Amazon myths. among the Greeks.
That's a really good point. This is all coming together now.
And plus, the Greeks used to say about the Persians that the Persians were, they used to say they were pansies and basically cucks who were like under the thumb of their women, and they're, at the Persian court, and women called all the shots and so on and so forth. And because the Greeks were extremely patriarchal, paternalistic people. But yeah, in the ancient Persian military, you had female admirals in the Persian Navy. Okay, so all right, so Pythagoras is also getting this from the teaching of Zarathustra, the place that women have in the Pythagorean order. And his notions of justice and of how governments should be run are clearly based on Zarathustra's idea of vohu chashatra, the best governance, or the most righteous form of regime, which is the rule of philosophers. Okay, the system that he was setting up in real life with Kavi Vishtaspa, his patron, where basically he was a court philosopher determining court policy. And so this is an idea that Pythagoras is getting from Zarathustra, and that then Plato, as a member of the Pythagorean order, adopts and articulates in Republic as, I was about to say philosopher kingship, but really it should be called philosopher guardianship, because women can be philosopher rulers as well.
Interesting.
So you find all these ideas, in the teachings of Pythagoras that are, and then of course, when we talk about archetypes, right? As I mentioned earlier, the whole notion of archetypes that you find at the core of Platonic ontology comes from the Pythagorean order. Plato is getting that through his membership in this secret society. And Pythagoras is getting that from Zarathustra via the Magi that he's studying with for a dozen years in the capital of the Persian Empire. Now, it's also noteworthy that Pythagoras only leaves Iran and goes, and let's remember, okay, Babylon, okay, it's in Iraq today. Iraq is a fake country. Iraq was created by the British colonialists. It's a fake country. The capital of Iran was in Iraq for 4 Iranian empires. The capital. Not only was Iraq part of Iran, it was the capital district, okay? So this Mesopotamia has spent the better part of the past 2,500 years as part of Iran, integral part of Iran, except for the period where the Ottoman Turks overran it and ruled it for a while before the British carved Iraq. Anyway, point being that he only leaves Iran, Pythagoras does, when the Persian Empire conquers his native island of Samos.
Right.
Then Pythagoras,
Samos, and he goes to Italy and sets up in Croton, Italy.
Exactly. So how come Pythagoras only leaves Iran when Iran conquers Samos? If you were some nationalist Greek, right, you would hate the Persians for conquering your homeland. No, this guy only leaves Iran and goes back to his homeland once it's under Iranian rule. Okay, so he's clearly aligned. And then, right, and then and we're going to talk about Heraclitus too, and his politics and how that was aligned with the Persian Empire. But he goes from Samos, as you mentioned, to Italy, and he sets up the Pythagorean schools in southern Italy. Well, if you ask me, what this looks like is he was sent on a mission.
Yeah.
The Magi sent him. They said, okay, go now. He was an evangelist, basically. Go now and preach this doctrine in the West, spread this wisdom in the West. And he sets up these schools in Italy, which then are burned down by the local, feudal aristocracy, because these guys don't want their women in school. They don't want, their women becoming, uppity and talking back and not being good housewives who can, be in the kitchen and so on and so on and so forth.
Yeah, they were like a warrior cults back over there, basically.
Yeah, Pythagoras tried to basically seize control of the government of southern Italy. He had basically all these politicians he was training to carry out a coup d'etat and create a philosopher kingship in southern Italy. And the local landed aristocracy became wise to this, and they burned down the Pythagorean schools. But of course, the schools spread, and then we had important initiates of these schools, most notably Plato. And so then this Zoroastrian influence gets passed on to Plato. Okay, so but Pythagoras is an important figure here, because why? Who were the 2 people besides Jesus that the Carpocratians set up statues of?
Plato.
Pythagoras and Heraclitus. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Plato. Pythagoras and Plato. Who were the two major influences on Plato? Pythagoras. So people think, okay, of Socrates when they think of Plato, all right? But I'm going to make a very long story short. Socrates was a war veteran who was a bum on the streets. Socrates was like a Vietnam War vet bum who was a real wise ass. That's the kind of person he was. Plato takes him and he turns him into this grand dramatic persona after the death of Socrates. So it's true that Socrates was important, like for Plato, when Plato was a teenager or very young man in his early 20s and whatever, he was an early mentor to him, but he was like a bum on the street who was...
Because he also teaches people like Diogenes, and you get the cynics that come out of him too.
Exactly.
So
that's the type he is.
Yeah.
But Socrates wasn't an important influence on Plato in terms of his thinking. The doctrines that Plato puts in the mouth of Socrates are influenced by two figures in particular. One is Pythagoras, because Plato went on to join the Pythagorean order after he was a sworn brother of the order, which this could be a whole other program to talk about, the Illuminati and the beginning of the Illuminati and, who Plato really was and how much he left unsaid in his writings and so on and so forth, his esoteric doctrine.
That's the next one.
The other thing, the other major influence on Plato was Heraclitus.
Right.
Aristotle tells us that in the period after the death of Socrates and before Plato joined the Pythagorean order, why are we going through all this? Because of the Carpocratians. And they worship Plato together with Pythagoras and Jesus. So Aristotle tells us that in that period after the death of Socrates and before Plato becomes a sworn member of the Pythagorean order, Plato studied under this Heraclitean teacher Cratylus. And Plato was a zealous Heraclitean. He had completely internalized the worldview of Heraclitus. And Aristotle says it's only on the basis of the Heraclitean worldview that Plato then builds up this ontology of an epistemology of forms, the concepts, the eidos, and so on and so forth. But the backdrop for Plato's sophisticated ontology and epistemology of forms is an acceptance of Heraclitus's view of the world as flux and various other notions of Heraclitus about the nature of cosmic justice and so forth. So who are the two main influences on Plato? Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Okay, we talked about Pythagoras' connection to Iran and to Zarathustra.
Absolutely, you demonstrated that. Yeah.
Now let's talk about Heraclitus. All right.
Because
Heraclitus.
A lot of people bring this up that Heraclitus is very Zoroastrian in his thinking. So let's go through this.
Heraclitus has a number of ideas in his what we call it fragments. It was a book that was called On Nature, and now only fragments are left of it. He has a number of ideas in that text that have no precedent in Greek culture, but align directly with Zarathustra's teaching.
He criticizes all the Greeks and their like he's very much like a Tupac of his day, like criticizing everyone else, but being like sort of like going against the grain.
Look, he attacks Homer and Hesiod.
Yeah.
Vehemently. I mean, this would be the equivalent of being a Satanist in that time. You're ripping the Bible to pieces. Right. Homer and Hesiod were the Bible of that time, and he's just trashing them.
Right.
Okay. And now, why is he trashing them? Because very much in alignment with Zarathustra, Heraclitus is saying that these gods that these guys write about, Homer and Hesiod, these Olympians, these are not the true divinities. The true divinity is a divine mind, okay? It's a divine mind that expresses itself as cosmic order and that is best symbolized by an undying and ever-changing fire. Spenta Mainyu and Ashal Vahishta. Okay, Spenta Mainyu is the cosmic order, and Ashal Vahishta is its being best symbolized by fire, or energy ever-changing in its forms. And another idea that you find there is that everything in nature advances, proceeds, unfolds according to dialectical opposition. There is a struggle between dialectically opposed forces that they are in tension with one another, and their dynamic tension is creative or constructive, and it's what moves the world forward. Well, this is also at the core of the teaching of Zarathustra. in that, and this is a very subtle and important point. Angraminu is also necessary. You don't want to get rid of Angraminu. Angraminu or Ahriman is also necessary. It's the struggle between Spenta Mainyu and Angraminu that makes the world work.
It's like when a fire or when a forest burns down, it comes back even greater, and there's more life after that. Sort of.
Yes, and it's also like a chess game.
Yeah.
Angraminu are the black pieces on the board. And so the divine mind of Ahura Mazda wants an opponent.
Right.
And notice the ethos behind this mentality, right? It's a very chivalric, noble-minded ethos, which says, I want evil to go ahead and do its best. I want an opponent. It's the Olympics ethos, the ethos of agonistic struggle that we find in the Greek Olympics.
You have to have that contrast to make that move.
Well, and also it's not just a contrast, it's what makes you your best. You play your best game against a strong opponent.
Exactly.
But it takes a certain depth of soul to have that kind of ethos, right? I mean, really niggardly, petty people want to just eliminate all opposition. The strong and noble-minded person, a free spirit, wants to face the best opposition so that they can become the best version of themselves and find out what they're really capable of. And so this is also a notion of Zarathustra that winds up at the heart of the teaching of Heraclitus. And then there are these peculiar things in there that there's nowhere they could have come from but from Zarathustra and Iranian culture. Like Heraclitus says, don't keep corpses around and, engage in ceremonial, rites around corpses and bury them or whatever. He says, throw them out like dung. Throw corpses out quicker than crap, literally is what he puts in his text.
That's literally what's written in his Avesta. Like
exactly.
Even so you can rip your nails off and throw that on the ground. That's got to be disposed in a certain way.
Zoroastrians would take corpses immediately to the outskirts of the city, and they would put them on these rocky outcrops for vultures to descend on the corpses and basically to feed nature, because you don't need your body anymore at that point. Your spirit is gone on. So they just take the corpses and they strip them down to the bone in these places and let vultures feed on them. In any case, they throw them out from the populated area. And Heraclitus says this in the fragments. Well, this is totally anathema to traditional Greek funerary rites. And there's only one place he could have gotten it from. And then when we look at his politics, okay, it's just absolutely, undeniably obvious when we look at Heraclitus's politics. He is vehemently opposed to democracy. He believes that the wise should rule and that the best men, meaning the ones with the most cultivated intellect, should be the guardians of a society. And he's so committed to this idea that when his personal friend, Hermodorus, the satrap, the Persian governor of Ephesus, okay, so Heraclitus's buddy was the Persian governor of Ephesus, a guy called Hermodorus. And when this guy is overthrown in an Ephesian revolt against Persian rule, Heraclitus says of his fellow citizens, they should all be hanged to the last man, and the city should be left to the children.
Yeah, and that's, by the way, this is in Turkey, so it's not like he's he's in Asia already. So
he's in the Persian Empire. This is a part of Greece that was ruled by the Persian Empire. His buddy Hermodorus is literally the Persian governor, the governor the Persians appointed to rule Ephesus. And when Hermodorus is deposed in a attempted coup by the Ephesians, an attempted Greek revolt against Persian rule, he says, these Greeks here, these morons, these rabble, he calls them rabble, uneducated, mass, unthinking herd of people who, in the name of democracy, revolted against Hermodorus. He says they should all be executed to the last man. Leave the children to run the city. And then, okay, so
he was a contemporary of Thales too. Thales was a monotheist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And then, in the midst of this situation, Darius, the Persian emperor, sends a letter to Heraclitus saying, come be the court philosopher of Iran.
Wow.
Darius the Great in all of his inscriptions on mountainsides in Iran, on rock cliffs in Iran, prefaces his decrees with, in the name of Ahura Mazda and of Arta.
Absolutely.
Order.
Absolutely Zoroastrian.
So he's a Zoroastrian monarch. He's legitimating himself through the teachings of Zarathustra. And he says to Heraclitus, come be the court philosopher of the Persian Empire. Now, if you didn't think that this guy was Zoroastrian in his thinking,
they wouldn't allow him there.
Him.
No way he would be asked to be a court philosopher if he didn't already have aligned thinking. To a high degree, too. Not just a little. Exactly. To a high degree.
If he didn't epitomize the worldview of the ancient Iranians.
Wow.
So this is really telling. And then what does Heraclitus do? He writes him back. And he basically says, thank you, but no thank you. I don't think court life would suit me. It's a little too luxurious for me. And I'm not going to abandon my post.
Yeah.
And, you should come here. And so instead, Heraclitus goes and he exiles himself to the temple of Artemis. He doesn't leave the temple for the rest of his life because his attitude is basically, I hate these people. These are not my kinsmen. These people who revolted against Hermodorus, who revolted against the Persians. And he makes the temple of Artemis, again, Arta Amesha, immortal truth, this Iranian goddess figure, right? He makes her temple his home for the rest of his life. And this is where the fragments were, kept. The first copy of the fragments were kept by the priestesses of the temple of Artemis. And he would only come out to play with children on the steps of the temple, the children that, parents would bring when they came to worship Artemis. They would leave their children on the temple steps, and Heraclitus would be out there playing games with these children. It's like, I prefer to talk to them than to talk to any of you. I'll play with the children, thank you very much. And so anyway, and by the way, there's this beautiful fragment where he says that the aeon is a child at play, moving pieces in a game. Sovereignty belongs to the child. Wow. And this is Heraclitus understanding what Zarathustra really was after in this opposition between Spenta Mainyu and Angra Mainyu as part of the divine intelligence of Ahura Mazda, where there is a cosmic game on, like a chess game, or like backgammon, which is Iranian in origin. And the point is to play a good game and a creative game. In any case, I think that Heraclitus did that. He maintained his post. He sequestered himself to the Temple of Artemis because he was waiting for Darius to come to him, not the other way around. In other words, he was saying to the Persian Empire, you come back and reassert rule here and in Greece in general. And so in this person, very much like Pythagoras, we're dealing with an agent of the Persian Empire.
These were progressive minds that saw the Persian post, saw the rule of Darius and Cyrus as like a modern or an ancient rendition of what today is like the UN, like overarching but also just, fair, knowledgeable, intelligent, and good for the world instead of having like warring states periods.
Yeah, I mean the United Nations is so corrupt.
Right. I'm just saying the idea.
You know what I think it's more like? I'll tell you what I think it's more like. It's like the United States at its foundation. The Persian Empire, the United States, Thomas Jefferson.
Washington.
Thomas Jefferson was very deeply influenced by Iranian ideas that he got from reading Greek authors. He had a vast library of classical Greek texts. He read Greek, and he was influenced by the Persians via the Greeks. And so the federal constitution of the United States was very much a reflection of the satrapy system of the Persian Empire.
Exactly. Not Judeo-Christian, because think about it. There's not a single script, not a single lick of Deuteronomy or Numbers in the Constitution. It is.
I mean, it's preposterous. Look, Jefferson took scissors to the Bible. I mean, this is a whole other conversation. The founding fathers despised Christianity. The founding father, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, the Illuminati, 33rd degree Freemason. Anyway, be that as it may. But to go to your point, it's more not like the UN so much. It's more like when Tom Paine says, I think it was in The Rights of Man, the book that he wrote in Did he write The Rights of Man in Prison in France? I think so.
Yeah.
And so Tom Paine, the black sheep of the founding fathers, he says that the Liberty Bell of the American Revolution is not just for all nations on earth. It should resound through the whole cosmos. And
same guy who called Christ a fable too.
Oh, he destroyed the Bible.
Yeah.
And by the way, not only did he think the U.S. Constitution shouldn't be based on the Bible, he said that the U.S. Constitution is not compatible with Christianity, and until we get rid of Christianity, we cannot have a functional government in this country. Anyway, be that as it may, when Paine is saying that the American Revolution and the system of liberty and the protection of personal rights that it's setting up is a standard for the whole world, that's what the ancient Persian emperors were after. They were after creating a universal order based on progress and the liberty of the individual. So, yeah, in any case.
Yeah, you just laid out, like, I think it's just completely clear that these pillars of the West, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, and then eventually Plato, and then, you know, who would be sort of passed down through the Aristotelian mind, and which branches out in many different directions. This comes from Zoroaster. He's the monad in its own way, like, to use the figure of speech.
Where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is that, look, if the Carpocratians are worshiping statues of, or at least honoring statues of Pythagoras and then of Plato, who's influenced by Pythagoras and Heraclitus, what does that tell you about where the Carpocratian teaching is coming from originally, right? And I want to come back to the Carpocratians in 1 minute, and this is going to become really important. The point about Zarathustra and the Carpocratians and then Persian Gnosticism. But let me also note that I was listening to your conversation with, is it David Litwa?
M. David Litwa.
Yeah. And Litwa, in response to a question you asked very rightly about Persian influence on Simon Magus. And Litwa says, no, you know, there was a much closer source for Simon Magus than anything Zoroastrian, and that would have been Heraclitus. Well, we've already established how deeply influenced by Zarathustra Heraclitus is, okay? But I don't buy that Simon Magus is getting these ideas even from Zarathustra via Heraclitus. I think he's getting them directly from Zarathustra, and I'll tell you why. When he describes the, divine intelligence, not just as a cosmic fire, which is a very Zoroastrian symbol that you find in Heraclitus.
Yes, he calls God a fire. He said God is a fire. Yeah.
He also talks about the seventh power, and you don't find this in Heraclitus. This is nowhere in Heraclitus. It's nowhere in any Greek thought. The seventh power, or emanation of the divine intelligence, which is thought, the divine thought, right? The thinking power of the divine, which is the seventh emanation. That's Spenta Mainyu. There are 7 Amesha Spenta, 7 of them. The seventh one, the highest one, is Spenta Mainyu, which is what? The power of thought, the divine thought, right?
I forgot about that. I wasn't even putting 2 to 2 together. That makes a lot of sense now.
It's the divine mind of Ahura Mazda, which Zarathustra and the Gathas says that, the mind of Ahura Mazda exploded into myriad sparks of light and manifested the cosmic order, in the Gathas.
So Christianity, with all these maguses and magois, this is sort of
that's another thing.
It's a sort of a descendant, a branch off of this Magi Zoroastrian.
Exactly. Look, Simon Magus. There's a reason he's called, whether Litwa likes to call him Magus or not, but there's a reason he was called that.
Yeah.
He was called Magus because he was a Magi. He was a member of the Order of the Magi.
And one of the first Christian cults to be in Rome, like during the time of Saint Linus, who's supposedly the guy who was anointed by Peter. We're talking like the 1st century, these Simonians who were worshiping Simon Magus, apparently, according to Irenaeus and Hippolytus. So who knows how accurate it is, but let's take them at their word value. Then that means the first Christians to show up in Rome were Magi.
And this whole notion that some scholars, Western, I was gonna use an epithet, but I'll just pass over that. A lot of Western scholars try to dismiss the significance of this term magus by saying, well, it just meant a practitioner of magic or alchemy or whatever. No, look, the Greeks who brought magic to Greece were accused of Medism. There was a crime in Greece called Medism.
Really?
Coming from the Medes, the Median people, one of the four branches of the ancient Iranians. The Medes are closest to today's Kurds. And they ruled Iran before the Persians. The Persians overtook the Medes and incorporated them into the Persian Empire. So the Medes were the first Iranians that the Greeks had encountered, and the Magi are the priests or wise men of the Medes. And Magi, wise men of the Medes, people practicing magic in Greece, and also the revolutionary pre-Socratic philosophers were accused of Medism, meaning bringing foreign Iranian specifically ideas to Greece in a way that's considered treasonous, like, the McCarthy hearings in America, where they were all calling these guys commies and Russian agents and whatever. Right?
Well, it's like Socrates' trial. He gets executed for importing foreign deities. No one even knows what those are.
His teacher, Socrates' teacher, Aspasia, she wasn't, like I said, the guy was a bum. So she wasn't his teacher in any formal sense, but there was this older woman that he hung out with, and he was very influenced by her, Aspasia, and she was a mistress of Heraclitus, I believe. And anyway, she was accused of Medism. She was one of these people who actually was charged with Medism. Wow. So it's not true that magus just meant magician. Magus had a very culturally specific connotation, and it meant those people associated with that Iranian shit over there.
I've actually heard someone else tell me exactly what you just said just now.
Yeah.
Other people very, very entrenched in this type of area. It became a slang term, basically. Yeah. Like, you're a magi, but really that can mean a million things.
Right.
It's like Gnostic. Like, what's a Gnostic? I don't know. It's Valentine.
Yeah, but my point is, it had a culturally specific association. Right. And so, aside from the fact that you got Simon Magus talking about cosmic fire and the seventh power as the divine intellect, God's power of thought, which you don't find even in Heraclitus, the guy's identified as a magi, as a member of the Magian order. So you got this association of Simon Magus with Zarathustra. And then to go back to the Carpocratians, okay? This is something I think your viewers may not be familiar with, and it's tremendously significant. So the Carpocratians were accused of having all these basically ecstatic orgies, and, that they were libertines who believed in not just relinquishing private property, but in overcoming the notion of property that underlies monogamous marriage. In other words, holding other people as property, right? Being able to overcome the aspects of the human ego that express themselves in greed and avaricious behavior. And so they were radical communists who didn't only want to abolish private property, they thought that love was somehow diminished or constrained by monogamous marriage and its association with property holding and the whole patriarchal economic system of the time. And interestingly enough, there is a Gnostic sect in Iran who has exactly this same teaching called the Mazdakites. And these Mazdakites claimed to be the true heirs to the teaching of Zarathustra. They thought that the Sassanid Persian Empire, the second Persian Empire, there are three Iranian empires in antiquity: the Achaemenid Empire, the Parthian Empire, and the Sassanid Empire. But the Parthians were Scythians. They were not Persians. So the second Persian Empire is the Sassanid Persian Empire from about 200 AD to 650, when they were conquered by Islam, 650 AD. And during the Sassanid Persian Empire, these Mazdakites, again, Mazda means wisdom, right?
Right.
So these Mazdakites, they argued that the Sassanid priesthood had set up an orthodoxy that was a total perversion of the teachings of Zarathustra. And they represented the true teachings of Zarathustra. And interestingly enough, they're advocating communism, the abolishing of private property, right? But then also free love and a transcendence of monogamous marriage, and basically, open, amorous relationships between men and women and so forth, which was for them also a way of breaking up harems and destroying aristocratic bloodlines, right? Destroying the landed feudal aristocracy. And although so now the Mazdakites, as radical as this teaching seems, the Mazdakites were able to seize control of the Sassanid Persian Empire for no less than 30 years in the early 500s, 505 to 520s, 530 AD, through a court minister called Mazdak. This movement, which was subsequently named after him, but had an older name I'll come to in a moment, this movement seized control of the Persian state. There was a king who, Kavod, who supposedly was sympathetic to it, and he basically let Mazdak have free reign, and they took over the government, and they created insane, radical, Gnostic, communist society in Iran for 30 years.
Wow.
Okay? Before they were finally, of course, you can imagine how the story ended. They were all massacred.
It's right before Islam comes around.
Right, exactly. Well, the trauma of this incident is, I think, in large part what rendered the Persian Empire vulnerable to being conquered by Islam. There had been an internal revolution and civil war before the Arabs came in and made short work of it. That's why the Persian Empire was so vulnerable.
Yeah.
They had basically turned on themselves first.
Makes a lot of sense.
But here's my point, is that if you look in the heresiological texts about the Mazdakites, they all say that this movement was already hundreds of years old when it took control of the state, which kind of makes sense. I mean, for it to have become that powerful and entrenched that it could actually topple the government, it would take a long time, right, to build that kind of following throughout the whole of the Persian Empire. And they say the movement actually goes back to at least 200 AD. And when are we dealing with the Carpocratian order? About 50 to 100 years earlier, right? And so these are very close in historical time frame. And
not to mention the writings that are found from Nag Hammadi and other places in Egypt, like Alexandria, that are related to movements such as the Carpocratians and other movements, mostly in Egypt, Christianity. They're Zoroaster and his grandfather, what's his name? Zosimos, I think it is.
Yes.
But yeah, this is not even like hidden or like through philosophy. They're literally reading and translating in Coptic the writings of Zoroaster and his grandfather. Right.
And so they say this movement goes back to like at least 200 AD. And it comes from the state of Iran, the province of Iran from which the Persian Empire gets its name, namely Persis, Parsa.
Right.
Okay. And which is around where Shiraz is today. It's where Persepolis, the ruins of Persepolis are. It's where the city of Shiraz is, where, the Shiraz wine comes from, and so on and so forth. Anyway, they say the guy who founded this movement, which was originally called Durosdinan, or the Partisans of Justice. Remember that text, the Carpocratian text on justice?
Yeah.
Social justice. So it was called the Movement of the Just. And its founder was a guy called Zarathustra, which is a Middle Persian Zarathustra. So we have the second Zarathustra, the second Zoroaster, preaching this doctrine, which is identical to the Carpocratian doctrine. And then the Carpocratians are setting up statues of Pythagoras and of Plato, who's influenced by Pythagoras and by Heraclitus, both of whom were Persian agents. And not incidentally, I neglected to mention that the Magi attended Plato's funeral.
Oh, that's right. That's a big deal.
They came from Iran. They attended Plato's funeral, and they said he was one of our own. They attended in the capacity of like honoring a brother.
That's a big deal. Oh, Zostrianos, that's the guy's name. Is that really his grandfather? Zoroaster's grandfather?
I don't think so, but I think that
Okay.
it's very significant that the Gnostics wanted to say that.
That's what I'm saying. They're attributing, even if they're making this up,
It's a pedigree they want to establish for
it
themselves.
shows you how entrenched, how interested, and how valuable Zoroastrian ideas were to the Gnostic movements in Egypt. The Coptics, Coptic Christian, that's what they were.
Absolutely. And then look, I mean, we've gone for a long time, but we can't neglect Mani, right? We can't neglect Mani.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up.
So many streams of Gnostic thought come from out of Mani and Manichaeism. Like, for example, the Bogomil movement of southeastern Europe, mainly associated with Bulgaria, but there's a lot of scholarship that says that it came from Constantinople originally.
Interesting.
So the Bogomil movement, and then you've got the Cathars in the Occitan region, which stretched from mainly southern France into part of Italy and part of Spain on the Mediterranean. The Cathar movement and the Bogomil movement were both branded by the inquisitors of the Catholic Church as, quote, Manichees, unquote.
Yeah.
Okay. So according to the
called it against the Manichees was the reputation. Yeah.
According to the Catholic Church, these people were Manichaeans.
Right. What does that tell you? That tells you this is a Persian movement to the eyes of the church.
In the eyes of the church, exactly. And so Mani, who was Mani? Mani was a Parthian royal. He was remember, so I mentioned there was the second Iranian Empire. It wasn't Persian, but it was Iranian, the Parthian Empire. They were descendants of Scythians. And
called himself a disciple of Jesus.
Yes. And so Mani was from a Parthian royal bloodline, born in Mesopotamia, which, again, the capital of Iran in the Parthian period was also in Mesopotamia, and at a city called Ctesiphon. And so he's from this royal lineage, and his mother's a Christian. And so his father is a Parthian, either Zoroastrian or Mithraist, probably in ancestry, and his mother is a Christian. And he basically develops this doctrine that intensifies the dualism latent in Zarathustra's message. So Zarathustra is not a dualist, right? I mean, this opposition between Spenta Mainyu and Angra Mainyu is still sort of under the divine intelligence of Ahura Mazda, and it's not meant to suggest that there is, on an ontological level, in other words, in the nature of reality, some kind of a split between a material world and a spiritual world. You don't find that in the Gathas. So Zarathustra is not an ontological dualist, okay, but he's got these two principles, and Mani takes these two principles of, by his time, it's Ormazd. It's a contraction of Ahura Mazda. Ormazd and Ahriman, contraction of Angra Mainyu. He takes these and he radicalizes them into a real substantive ontological dualism. And he says there are two worlds, a material world governed by Ahriman and a spiritual world like the Pleroma. That's the world of Ahura Mazda. And we are sparks of the divine that have been trapped in this material world. And we basically have it as our spiritual work to free this divine spark within us so that it can rejoin the light, the realm of light, and transcend this realm of dark physicality. And so he develops this Gnostic doctrine, and various elements of his teaching fuse ideas from Zarathustra, the Gnostic Jesus, which at this time we're talking, Mani is around 200, early 200s. AD. And in fact, specifically under the reign of Shapur the Great, and this is not incidental, Shapur the Great, the most militarily successful emperor of the Second Persian Empire, becomes the patron of Mani.
Right.
He becomes his patron, which is kind of bizarre. I mean, this guy, like, Shapur is like Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
He expanded the Persian Empire dramatically, and he takes Mani in. And I say it's bizarre because, people think of Manichaeism as this world-denying, ascetic doctrine of like, oh, go put yourself in a monastic cell somewhere and deny your physical impulses and try to purify your spirit and whatever. And there's no way that this could have been Mani's actual teaching, even if he prescribed some kind of a monastic way of life for a certain class of people. Shapur would never have taken in a guy like that into the court, and would never have backed this guy to go on evangelical missions as far afield as India and China. You know, the Manichaeans, their legacy survived for centuries in China. A lot of Manichaean texts that we have are actually from northwestern China. And so Shapur is backing this guy to go on these wide travels. And what's the deal here? Well, the deal is that Shapur is starting to conquer a large part of the Roman Empire. He's famously depicted in the Pars province of Iran that I mentioned earlier, on these stones next to Persepolis. He's depicted forcing Caesar Valerian of Rome to kneel before his horse. It's a great rock carving. You can look it up, very famous, of Shapur on horseback with Caesar Valerian of Rome on his knees, looking up to Shapur under the hooves of his horse. And so Shapur is conquering large parts of the Roman Empire in the west, and he's conquering large parts of India and all the way up to the border of western China in the east. And so Shapur is looking for a world religion. He wants to create one world religion. And he's looking at Mani as the guy who can do it for him. And so Mani takes Zarathustra and the Gnostic Jesus and Buddha, and he fuses them into one religion that includes belief in reincarnation and, you know, the Buddha of light and all these ideas you find that survive in Mahayana and Pure Land Buddhism and so forth, to create one world religion, a Gnostic religion.
Yeah, it's very similar to the Carpocratians in that sense, where they have these three figures.
Yes, and the Cathar way of life, I think, tells us a lot about what Manichaeism was like, because it's true that you had perfecti in the Cathar religion. They called them perfecti, perfected people, who lived a monastic life, and they were very ascetic. But these perfecti would only become perfecti when they were geezers, okay? It was old men and old women who would become perfecti. When the Cathars were younger, you know, in Occitanian culture, they were all mixed up with the troubadours, who were these traveling romantic poets. And they were also closely allied with the Knights Templar. And sometimes troubadours in medieval Occitan would become Cathar perfecti later in life. And sometimes Templar knights would become Cathar perfecti after living lives full of, you know, brutal conquest, right? And these wars of, you know, conquest in the Middle East and so forth. So you got like erotic poets who are libertines preaching basically all kinds of orgiastic, practices, and writing about them in these romantic poems that they sing in the courts of various medieval ladies. And you've got these, military men who are certainly not pacifists for most of their lives, and they're becoming Cathar perfecti. And so I think this shows you how Shapur was able to accommodate Mani's teaching, because it was not this naive, overly idealistic, world-denying teaching. It had different classes of worshipers, and it had a realistic view of human society. And the laity were not expected to adhere to this kind of asceticism that you find among the perfecti. And then, of course, there was a notion of reincarnation. So, you know, you had many lifetimes to perfect your soul, which you also find in the Cathars. So the Manichaeans are another group of Gnostics who are deeply influenced by Zarathustra. Zarathustra is one of the three great world teachers for Mani, again, together, like I mentioned earlier, with the Gnostic Christ and with Buddha. And so another major stream of Gnosticism influenced by Zarathustra is this radically dualist school that we see coming from out of Manichaeism and all of its offshoots, Bogomilism, Catharism, and so forth.
Yeah, that's so great. There's so much that comes all back to Zoroaster. You can just, it's like a bunch of lines, like trees branches that just go back to this time period. And it's a time period that's contemporary with a lot of other, Isaiah, Hosea, the Babylonians, and like it's it's just fascinating to think about it like that. I actually have a question for you, because I was thinking about this. There was the Second Temple period of Judaism. They had these high priests that are named Hyrcanus, and there's a thought that maybe they're from Hyrcania, and they were taking in priests that like knew ancient rites that they somehow lost after being captive in Babylon for all these time, and they wanted to bring in like priests that knew what they were doing, so they brought in these Hyrcanian priests. What do you think about that?
You said this is in the Second Temple period?
Yeah. And by the way, this is right after Cyrus was called the Messiah, not by, he's a Messiah like Solomon. No, he's my Messiah from the word of God himself, my shepherd. So that's a pretty big deal.
Listen, we could have a whole show on this subject, because I'm about to say something that's extremely incendiary in response to your question. But point being, I could back it up. By the way, if people are interested, this is the book in which I discuss Zarathustra at length.
Yeah.
It's quite a tome, actually.
I got a link in the description too, so people can buy it.
Iranian Leviathan. And I'm pointing to it right now because I have a whole chapter on what I'm about to say.
All right.
Which is very incendiary in response to your question. But we could do a whole show on it sometime.
Sure.
I think you're probably right. Why? Because, again, I apologize for this in advance, but the whole thing about Cyrus being the Messiah of the Jews and why Cyrus rebuilt the Temple of Solomon, okay, when he let the Jews of Babylon who had been in captivity move back home. Of course, a lot of them stayed back in Babylon. And by the way, do you know what the Jews who stayed behind in Babylon, in the capital of the Persian Empire, did instead of returning to Israel? They ran the banking system.
Oh.
The Persian emperor set up the first banking system of the world with standardized coinage. They invented checks. Checks were invented by the Persian emperor, specifically by Darius the Great. Wow. And the Jews were involved in the Babylonian banking system under the Persian Empire. And anyway, long story short, I make an argument in Iranian Leviathan in a chapter that I playfully titled this chapter, Tekel Tekel Mane Shekel.
Yeah, that's from Daniel.
Yeah. Well, it's a play on the words in Daniel.
Yeah.
Tekel Tekel Mane Shekel, because see the shekel. Shekel means image in Persian. Oh. It means face. And it was specifically referring to the face of Darius on the coins called darics. And so the word for, money in Hebrew comes from the image of Darius the Great on Persian coinage. In any case, I'm getting diverted.
Yeah.
The whole business of Cyrus the Great and the creation of the Second Temple and the relocation of the Jews, their odyssey back home to Israel, okay, and the writing of the Hebrew Bible as we know it today, which dates back to that time under Cyrus and Cambyses.
Yeah.
The whole thing was a Persian plot. I make an argument for this in Iranian Leviathan. Second Temple Judaism is a creation of an Illuminati elite who were Mithraists in the Persian Empire. And the transformations that we see inside Judaism, which are extensive at that time, that involve notions like punishment in hell, the individual soul, the coming apocalypse. I mean, all these ideas that you don't find at all in ancient Israelite religion. They are social engineering mechanisms that were specifically introduced into Judaism by Mithraic, I don't even want to call them priests, Mithraic social engineers, who had a much wider agenda in terms of creating a new world order, is what they were really after. And the banking system was part of that new world order, but a transformation in religion was also part of that new world order. And so Cyrus was not a Zoroastrian, Cyrus was a Mithraist. I make an argument for this. And the guy who he appointed to be responsible for the Second Temple project and the relocation of the Jews was a man named Mithridates, which means Mithra's justice.
Right.
He oversaw the whole Second Temple project.
Yeah.
So I would not be at all surprised if they brought Hyrcanians
Yeah.
to Israel.
There was two of them with that name too. And that's when baptism becomes a thing in Judaism too, at that time. So it all just makes sense. And the last thing I'm going to say is I'm going to blow some people's minds with this. I want to get your opinion, and then we can finish off. You can tie it all together. Last thing I want to say is this, because that movement continues up until the time of Pompey and Caesar. So the same year, well, I should say before that, Crassus tries to go into Parthia, fails, gets killed. Pompey the Great sacks the Temple of Jerusalem, and there's a big that's a big deal, because now the priesthood that is held by the Persians is now in the hands of, guess what? The same year, 63 BC, that Pompey sacks Jerusalem is the same year they hold an election, and Julius Caesar becomes the high priest of the entire Roman Empire. Pontifex Maximus, same title as Pope right now, by the way. Guess what else happens that year? Cicero is consul, and Augustus is born, baby Augustus, and the writers of, what's his name? I can't remember the guy's name who wrote this. But anyways, it's passed down through like Tacitus and Suetonius. They're all talking about this. This is widespread. You can go look this up. It's public knowledge. There was supposedly a star in the sky said any male to be born this year will be the king of the world. So they're basically saying Augustus is like a messiah. Anyways, long story short, let's fast forward a little bit. Julius Caesar gets killed. Julius Caesar had plans to go east. He had plans to do it. Alexander the Great was his god, basically. He wanted to be the next Alexander the Great, but he couldn't do it. Mark Antony also wanted to do the same thing, but he ends up battling with Augustus. Now, the question is, why didn't Augustus do it? Augustus had all the stars were aligned for Augustus to go east and do what Alexander the Great did. I'll tell you why. Nicholas of Damascus tells us why. The king of India, Porus, same name as the king that under Alexander the Great, just coincidentally, he sends delegates, Brahmin delegates, to go meet with Augustus, and they bring him tigers and lions and oils and fragments and all these exotic presents and money, and basically make a deal. And the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because right after this happens, oh, by the way, one of the delegates goes with Augustus to Eleusis to get initiated in these rites. And after apparently he saw something when he drank the kykeon, had the experience. Apparently he saw something that changed his life. He jumped into a fire after that and killed himself because he no longer had anything else to live for. His life was complete. He wanted to die at that moment. That's recorded in Nicholas of Damascus. Anyway, the reason why I brought all that up is because right after this, Augustus dedicates 72 temples across the empire, and a lot of them were Mithra temples. And he becomes obsessed with the fire of Vesta. No, don't let the fire of Vesta go out. And all of a sudden, Mithraism is a boom in the Roman Empire. So I don't think it's and I think that's what happened. I think something changed his mind with these delegates, and all of a sudden, Eastern religions were the hit. Christianity was not even that long after that. What do you think about that?
Very interesting. That's a fascinating story, which I hadn't heard before, but it makes a hell of a lot of sense to me because, as we discussed in the previous show we did on Mithraism, the Parthians had, of course, Parthia was the main rival of Rome. That was Iran in the time of the Roman Empire. And so he would have had to march against the Parthians. And like we discussed in the previous show we did together, the Parthians had extensive agents operating in the seats of power in the Roman Empire. And among the aristocracy in particular, they would infiltrate through the port cities using the Cilician pirates. And so I could well imagine that what you're saying was some kind of a Parthian plot where they decided to use Indians as emissaries because the Parthians had a lot of influence in north. They basically were trying to turn northwestern India was a vassal state of one or another Iranian Empire for almost all of its history. And the Parthians were trying to establish the same relationship with that part of India. So it's quite possible that the Indian emissaries that were sent there, the Parthians knew Romans aren't going to listen to us. And if we send, but we can send these Indians and they can basically do a psyop on these Romans and get them not to invade Parthia, and so who knows? That makes a lot of sense in that wider context of psychological warfare between Parthia and Rome.
Yeah. And if you want to, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We can do this for hours, but if you want to give it, anything else you want to say, tying everything together, or if you want to just promote your books or anything, and we'll finish off.
Well, the only book I would say, which I already pointed out, I mean, a lot of these subjects we've discussed are in Iranian Leviathan. I mean, that's really my major treatment of Zarathustra. Although there's a bit about Zarathustra, in particular relation to Gnosticism in this book as well, a novel folklore. I get into certain Gnostic teachings, in particular Manichaeism, and the ways in which it develops Zoroastrian ideas. But, I had been thinking to go on to a discussion of modern Gnosticism, but I see in retrospect that we could do a whole show on that subject, because you see, Zarathustra is rediscovered in the modern period, in the 1700s, by linguists, Darmester, and others who translate the Zend-Avesta for the first time into European languages. And then you've got people like Hegel and Nietzsche reading these texts in German translation. And Zarathustra then becomes very important for modern, like early modern European culture, to the point where you have Zarathustra become the mouthpiece for Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and Richard Strauss naming ultimately orchestral piece after Zarathustra. Mozart, in Mozart's Magic Flute, he appears as Zoroaster. So there's this whole revival of Zarathustra. Voltaire refers to Zarathustra as the religious prophet most suitable to the ideals of the Age of Enlightenment.
Yeah.
He calls him Zoroaster, of course.
Does Carl Jung have anything to do with it? Because I know he revamps Gnosticism in his own way, big time.
I'm sure Zarathustra is mentioned in Jung. Of course, Jung engages with Nietzsche.
Yeah.
So, via Nietzsche, he engages with Zarathustra. But Jungian psychology is so deeply indebted to the ideas that Plato absorbed from Zarathustra, in particular, the archetypes. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. So, and then the aspects of Jung that are often referred to as Gnostic, when people call Jung a Gnostic, those are really Zarathustrian, not to say Zoroastrian, but they go back to Zarathustra because, see, Jung is not a dualist. There's a lot of aspects of Jungian thought that don't fit various facets of Gnosticism, and the aspects of Jung that are Gnostic are the ones that Gnosticism shares in common with Zarathustra's teaching, or really has inherited from Zarathustra's teaching. Okay, so that's the
thing, because in the Red Book, he even talks about this whole battle between Satan and Christ, and nobody wins, and ends up being like this giant explosion where Abraxas comes out, and he's like the embodiment of all. He's everything. Like he is. You can't escape Abraxas. He's basically the one. He didn't say that, but that's basically what he's getting at. That's very
similar to Zorvanite ideas, and I know at some point you wanted to discuss.
We should get into that next time.
Zorvanism. So I'm envisioning another program we do together that's focused on what Eric Voegelin calls modern Gnosticism. In other words, the Gnosticism of the period of like Hegel and Nietzsche and even Auguste Comte and so forth. The Age of Enlightenment, right? Going into the 19th century, Gnosticism in that context, and the rediscovery of Zarathustra in that context, right? And that could be a context for also engaging with Zorvanism, because people said that, for example, Adler referred to Nietzsche as a Zorvanist Parsi without really knowing it, that Nietzsche's take on Zarathustra was basically the type of interpretation and adaptation of Zarathustra that we see in the ancient Zorvanites. So yeah, we could have a whole program on that, and I look forward to continuing the conversation there.
Well, guys, leave in the comments what you guys thought about all this, and if you want to add anything to the conversation, I will read them. And we will do this again in the near future, and you have just attained true Gnosis.
You have just attained true Gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.